Sylvia Likens, born January 3, 1949, was an American teenager tortured and murdered by the family of Gertrude Baniszewski and several neighborhood children. Sylvia's parents were carnival workers. Her three brothers regularly traveled with her parents, while Sylvia and younger sister Jenny were discouraged out of concern for their safety and education. Their father arranged for his daughters to board with Gertrude Baniszewski, the mother of two girls, Paula and Stephanie, with whom the sisters had recently become acquainted at high school. Gertrude would receive $20 weekly to care for the Likens daughters. During the initial weeks, the sisters were subjected to very little discipline or abuse. But after 2 weeks, the payments to house Sylvia and Jenny failed to arrive consistently, coming 1 or 2 days late. In response, Gertrude began venting her frustration at the sisters, beating their bare buttocks with various instruments such as a paddle, while making abusive statements. On one occasion both girls were beaten 15 times on the back, after Gertrude's daughter accused the sisters of eating too much at a church supper. On another occasion, Sylvia was accused of stealing candy she had actually purchased. By mid-August, Gertrude had begun to focus her abuse almost exclusively upon Sylvia, with her primary motivation likely being jealousy of the girl's youth and appearance, which she often verbalized in front of her own children. This initial abuse included beatings and starvation, forcing her to eat leftovers or spoiled food out of garbage cans. Sylvia was subjected to humiliation when she claimed to have a boyfriend. In response, Gertrude would tease her about gaining weight and openly implying she was pregnant. At one point, when her taunts didn't seem to faze Sylvia, she kicked her in the genitals. Gertrude's daughter Paula was herself pregnant, participated in attacking Sylvia. As the abuse became more regular, they even allowed a neighborhood boy named Randy Lepper to join in and force-feed Sylvia spoiled food. She vomited as a result and was later forced to consume what she regurgitated. Gertrude's other daughter, Stephanie, also allowed her 15-year-old boyfriend, Coy Randolph Hubbard, to brutally attack Sylvia, slapping her, banging her head against the wall, and flipping her backwards onto the floor. On another occasion, Paula beat Sylvia with such force that she broke her own wrist. Gertrude would later occasionally force Jenny to strike her own sister, beating Jenny if she did not comply. In July and August, Sylvia's parents would occasionally return to Indianapolis to visit their daughters, whenever their schedule afforded. On this occasion, neither girl exhibited any visible sign of distress about their mistreatment to their parents. This was because both were in the presence of Gertrude and her children. Gertrude eventually forbade Sylvia from attending school after she confessed to having stolen a gym suit from the school, due to Gertrude having refused to purchase the clothing for her. For this theft, Gertrude whipped Sylvia with a belt. Gertrude then switched her conversation to the evils of premarital sex before repeatedly kicking Sylvia in the genitals. Gertrude then burned Sylvia's fingertips with matches before further whipping her. As Sylvia had a smaller frame than the thick-armed Gertrude, she could not fight back. Gertrude would falsely claim to her children that Sylvia was insulting them, in the hope this would provoke her children to join in on her abuse. The Likens sisters were fearful of notifying family or their school of the abuse, as both were afraid that would worsen their situation. Jenny in particular had been threatened by Gertrude that she would be abused and tortured to the same degree if she did so. Jenny was ridiculed or beaten whenever she alluded to Sylvia's situation. On one occasion in September, the Likens encountered their older sister, Diana Shoemaker, at a local park. Both Jenny and Sylvia informed Diana about the abuse, adding that Sylvia was targeted for physical abuse for things she had neither said nor done. Neither sister mentioned the actual address where they resided, and initially, Diana believed her sisters exaggerating their claims. Stephanie's boyfriend, Coy Hubbard, and several of his classmates frequently visited the Baniszewski residence to both physically and verbally torment Sylvia. With Gertrude's active encouragement, these neighborhood children routinely beat Sylvia, lacerating her body, burning her skin with lit cigarettes over 100 times, and severely injuring her genitals. To entertain Gertrude and her teenage accomplices, Sylvia was forced at one point to strip naked in the living room, and forced by Gertrude to masturbate with a glass Pepsi bottle in their presence. Several weeks prior to this, Gertrude accused Sylvia of gluttony before she and Paula choked and bludgeoned her. The pair then subjected Sylvia to a scalding bath in order to cleanse her of sin, with Gertrude grabbing Sylvia's hair and repeatedly banging her head against the bath to revive her whenever she fainted. Shortly after this incident, the father of a neighborhood boy phoned their high school to anonymously report a girl with open sores living at the Baniszewski household. As Sylvia had not attended school for several days, a school nurse visited Gertrude to investigate these claims. Gertrude claimed that Sylvia had run away the previous week, and that she was unaware of her actual whereabouts, adding that Sylvia was out of control, and that her open sores were a result of Sylvia's refusal to maintain decent personal hygiene. Gertrude further claimed that Sylvia was a bad influence on both her own children and her sister. The school made no further investigations. The immediate neighbors of the Baniszewski were middle-aged couples, Raymond and Phyllis Vermillion. They witnessed Paula physically abusing Sylvia, who on both occasions had a black eye, and openly boasting about her mistreatment. Upon their second visit to the Baniszewski household, both observed Sylvia to appear extremely meek and pale. Nevertheless, the Vermillions never reported Sylvia's evident mistreatment to the authorities. Due to the frequency and brutality of the torture, Sylvia gradually became unable to control her bladder and bowels. Because of this, Gertrude threw Sylvia into the basement and tied her up. Here, Sylvia was often kept naked, rarely fed, and frequently deprived of water. Occasionally, she was tied to the railing of the basement stairs with her feet barely touching the ground. At this point, Sylvia's weakened mental state and malnutrition made her entire body occasionally numb to any physical stimuli. On one occasion, Gertrude held a knife aloft and challenged Sylvia to "fight me back," to which Sylvia replied she did not know how to fight. In response, Gertrude inflicted a light scour wound to Sylvia's leg. That evening, Sylvia desperately attempted to alert neighbors by screaming for help and hitting the walls of the basement with a spade. One immediate neighbor would later inform police she had heard the desperate commotion, and that she had identified the source as emanating from the basement, but since the noise suddenly ceased at 3 a.m. she decided not to inform police about the disturbance. Neighborhood children were also occasionally charged 5 cents apiece to see the display of Sylvia's body and to humiliate, beat, burn, and mutilate her. This was usually followed with her restrained and gagged, before placing her in a bathtub filled with scalding water, and proceeding to rub salt into her wounds. On one occasion, Gertrude and her 12-year-old son, John Jr., rubbed urine and feces from Gertrude's infant into Sylvia's mouth, before giving her a cup half filled with water and stating the water was all she would receive for the remainder of the day. Shortly thereafter, Gertrude heated a needle, carving the words "I'm a prostitute, and proud of it," onto Sylvia's abdomen. When Gertrude was unable to finish the branding, she instructed one of the neighborhood children present to finish etching the words into Sylvia's flesh. They then proceeded to use an anchor bolt in an attempt to burn the letter S beneath Sylvia's left breast. Later that day, Gertrude displayed the carving to neighborhood children, claiming Sylvia had received the inscription at a sex party. On October 25, Jenny and Sylvia attempted to escape from the basement after overhearing a conversation to abandon Sylvia to die. When Sylvia was lucid enough, they attempted to flee to the front door. However, due to her extensive injuries and general weakness, Gertrude caught her before she could escape the property. Sylvia was then given crackers to eat, but was unable to consume the food due to her extreme state of dehydration. Gertrude forced the crackers into her mouth before repeatedly striking her face with a curtain rod. Coy Hubbard then took the curtain rod from Gertrude and struck Sylvia one further time, rendering her unconscious. By the morning of October 26, Sylvia was unable to either speak intelligibly or coordinate her movement. Gertrude propped her back against a wall, attempted to feed her a donut and a glass of milk. She threw Sylvia to the floor in frustration when Sylvia was unable to correctly move the glass of milk to her lips. Shortly thereafter, Sylvia became delirious, repeatedly moaning and mumbling. When Paula asked her to recite the English alphabet, Sylvia was unable to recite anything beyond the first 4 letters or to raise herself off the ground. Minutes later, Sylvia unsuccessfully attempted to bite into a rotten pear she had been given, stating she could feel the looseness in her teeth. In an attempt to wash Sylvia, a laughing John Jr. sprayed her with an indoor hose. Sylvia again desperately attempted to exit the basement, but collapsed before she could reach the stairs. In response to this effort, Gertrude stamped upon Sylvia's head, standing for several moments, but Sylvia barely moved. When Stephanie realized that Sylvia was not breathing, Gertrude repeatedly shouted to the children that Sylvia was faking her death. She was 16 when she finally succumbed to her injuries. Gertrude initially beat Sylvia's corpse with a book, shouting, "Faker," in order to rouse her. However, she soon panicked and instructed Richard Hobbs to call the police. When police arrived, Gertrude led the officers to Sylvia's emaciated, extensively bludgeoned and mutilated body, lying upon a soiled mattress. She claimed she had been doctoring the child for an hour, having applied rubbing alcohol to Sylvia's wounds in a futile attempt at first aid, before she had died. She continued her lies that Sylvia had run away with several teenage boys, before returning to her house half-naked that afternoon. But Jenny revealed the truth to the police, which prompted officers to arrest Gertrude, Paula, Stephanie, and John Jr. on suspicion of murder, within hours of the discovery of her body. The same day, teenage neighbors Coy Hubbard and Richard Hobbs were also arrested and charged with the same offenses. The three eldest Baniszewski children, plus Coy Hubbard, were placed in the custody of a nearby juvenile detention center. The younger Baniszewski children and Richard Hobbs were detained at the Indianapolis Children's Guardians Home, all held without bail. Initially, Gertrude denied any involvement in Sylvia's death, and threw the kids under the bus, particularly her daughter Paula and Coy Hubbard, that they physically and emotionally abused Sylvia, stating, "Paula did most of the damage, and Coy Hubbard did a lot of the beating." She became evasive when one officer stated the likely reasons Sylvia became incontinent were her mental distress and injury to her kidneys. Lacking any remorse, Paula signed a statement admitting to repeatedly beaten Sylvia with her mother's belt, and inflicting other acts of brutality, including pushing her down the stairs into the basement 2 or 3 times, and inflicting a black eye. John Jr. admitted to having used his fists to abuse her. He admitted to having burned Sylvia with matches on several occasions, adding that his mother had repeatedly burned the child with cigarettes. 5 other neighborhood children who had participated in Sylvia's abuse were charged, subsequently released into the custody of their parents under subpoena. On December 30, 1965, the grand jury returned first-degree murder indictments against Gertrude and 2 of her 3 oldest children, Paula and John Jr. Also indicted were Richard Hobbs and Coy Hubbard. All were charged with inflicting a culmination of fatal injuries to Sylvia Likens, with premeditated malice. One of the first witnesses to testify was Deputy Coroner Charles Ellis, stating that Sylvia's fingernails were broken backwards, numerous deep cuts and punctures covered much of her body, and that her lips were essentially in shreds, due to her having repeatedly bitten and chewed upon them, due to starvation. He noted burn marks around Sylvia's genitals, as well as bruises and scratches. She had been in an acute shock 2 to 3 days prior to death to offer much resistance to any form of subjected treatment. On May 10, a Baptist minister named Roy Julian testified to having known a girl was being abused in the Baniszewski household. He had failed to report this to authorities, having been informed by Gertrude that Sylvia had made advances to men for money, so he believed she was punished for soliciting. The same day, 13-year-old Judy Duke testified, admitting to having witnessed Sylvia once endure salt being rubbed into sores upon her legs until she screamed. Duke also testified to one occasion where she witnessed Shirley Baniszewski rip open Sylvia's blouse in front of others. 2 days later, Richard Hobbs testified, describing how Gertrude begun etching the insult into Sylvia's abdomen before asking him to finish the task. When Marie Baniszewski was called to the stand as a witness, she broke down and admitted that although all 5 defendants had repeatedly physically and mentally tormented Sylvia, she had most often witnessed her mother and sister committing these acts. Another witness, Grace Sargent, stated Paula openly bragging about breaking her own wrist due to beating Sylvia. Sargent testified Paula had finished her boasting by stating that she tried to kill her. The following day, Gertrude denied any responsibility, claiming her children and other children in her neighborhood committed the acts within her home, which she described as being such a madhouse. She also added that she had been too preoccupied with her ill health and depression to control her children. A court-appointed doctor testified his belief that Gertrude was sane and fully in control of her actions. Deputy Prosecutor Marjorie Wessner delivered the state's closing argument, described Sylvia's abuse as stomach-wrenching, and compared the severity equivalent to that committed in Nazi concentration camps. On May 19, 1966, the panel found Gertrude guilty of first-degree murder, recommending a sentence of life imprisonment. Paula was found guilty of second-degree murder, and Hobbs, Hubbard, and John Jr. were found guilty of manslaughter. Upon hearing Judge Rabb pronounce the verdicts, Gertrude and her children burst into tears and attempted to console each other. Hobbs and Hubbard remained impassive, and each received sentences of 2 to 21 years, to be served in the Indiana Reformatory. Following her 1985 release from prison, Gertrude never accepted full responsibility for Sylvia's prolonged torment and death, and primarily blamed her asthma medication. Gertrude lived in relative obscurity until her death due to lung cancer at the age of 61. In June 2001, a 6-foot-tall granite memorial was formally dedicated to Sylvia Likens' life and legacy in Willard Park, Indianapolis. This dedication was attended by several hundred people, including members of the Likens family, and continues to receive visitors and flowers to this day.